Hi, and welcome back to ConTinual. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight, in space, no one can hear you scream, but in the audience, there might be a few groans. We're going to be talking all about the Alien franchise. So let's go around and see who is joining in and see exactly how many survivors we might have by the time this thing is done. So, Elektra, you're up first.
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor, and I'm ready to start screaming.
Derek?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Derek Austin Johnson. I write predominantly horror fiction. I've had stories in Parsec, Generation X, Interior Skies, and last year I had my own encounter with a near chestburster.
And Lee.
Hey, I'm Lee Martindale. I sling short fiction as a writer and an editor. I edit anthologies. Alien, one of the Alien movies may have been the last horror movie I watched.
So let's get a little bit of feel, for part of the Waitani universe here, right? So when we look at, the big universe, I want to talk about what your first experience was with it. I remember as a kid, my misspent youth, catching it on HBO, right? It was on late at night, probably up later than I should have been. I guarantee I was up later than I should have been watching stuff and I shouldn't have been. And Alien came on, and I'm like, okay, great, let's go see what the whole thing is about, because I remember it was like the featured movie of the month and all that kind of good stuff. That's where I got my dive into the Alien Enterprise, right? And the entire thing and going through and watching. So, Elektra, what were your thoughts, and where did you first enter the Alien franchise?
Somebody talked me into sitting through the first movie when it was rerun on TV, when I was an undergrad, in the living room where we had our TV. And, usually we were there for the news and Doctor Who, but late one night we all sat around and watched Alien, and that was my first experience with it.
Derek?
A little complicated, as everything is with me. My first real encounter with this was not the movie, but actually the parody done by Cracked Magazine in the late 70s. You have to understand, at the time the movie was released, I was probably 11 years old. I was not allowed to watch R-rated movies. As somebody who liked monsters, but wasn't really fond of horror at that time, I was curious, but I also heard that it was a pretty gruesome affair. So when Cracked Magazine presented its parody, I was all over it. And the way they handled it was that, you could cleverly, it was a guide to where you shield your eyes. When do you not want to see this? When the chest burster occurs, they're going, okay, we want to make sure you not only close your eyes, but cover your ears as well, that sort of thing. I didn't approach it until a couple of years later when I actually read Alan Dean Foster's novelization. Again, still too uncomfortable to actually try to find it playing in a theater or on cable, much less as a wherever it might be playing. So I read the book, which I actually really enjoyed. And it wasn't until I was probably about 16 or thereabouts when videotapes were fairly regularly available that I finally got to watch it someplace.
Lee, what about you?
I first saw it in the theater, first run. Sitting between my then husband and my still best friend, and put bruises on both of them. 5 little fingerprint size bruises, one on each arm. I swore never again. This was supposed to be a science fiction movie. Why is it coming off like a horror flick? But it was Classic.
So one of the things to me that I thought was, and even the first time I saw it, that really resonated with me is the universe you're stepping into, right? It wasn't Star Trek. It wasn't a clean bridge. It wasn't any of these kinds of things. It was you were walking onto the bridge of a space truck. It felt lived in. It felt like it was beat up. It had a lot of that same sort of Star Wars. You felt like you were walking into a lived in world, right? The keyboards and everything were a little dirty. They looked worn. It looked like, the crew chambers and everything else all had that look of, we've been out here for a long time in this crap, and this thing needs a good overhaul. So, and I think that's one of those things that they did a pretty good job of carrying forward in the first few films. Then as we went along, it's harder to do that and make it look realistic. But Derek, I'll start with you on this one. What about kind of the bigger aesthetic, the look, the feel that you're walking into in the Alien universe?
I'm really going to jump off what you said. It was literally that idea that this was all lived in. The engineers are wearing Hawaiian shirts and sneakers. Everybody's wearing sneakers. That was really remarkable in a science fiction movie where everything was, in the words of Ridley Scott with regards to Blade Runner, horizontal zippers and silver jumpsuits. No, instead, you get something that has a lot of grimy metal platforms that you have to walk up and down on. It was these jackets that were frayed and worn. The caps had the lettering of the Nostromo, but it was starting to fray as well. More than anything, it was just a sense that this was something that actually felt like you could be here, as opposed to, say, Logan's Run, which we all knew was basically just a mall. That sort of thing. Add to this, this was at a time too. Yeah, Star Wars was really sort of inundating the idea that the future of science fiction can be grimy. You can see the sand in the engines. You can taste the dehydration in everything. You had stuff like Outland, which was kind of a companion piece to Alien. I never really warmed to that one, but it had the same sorts of things. Everybody's a blue collar worker. Everybody's really, and this is not something I really understood until I was much older, but everybody's complaining about how much they're making going on this journey. Nobody here is a professional. You have one scientist, but everybody else basically they're truck drivers. So they carry around the crew humor. They carry around the class consciousness of, I can't believe we're being asked to divert. You want me to go down there and take a look at this? Fine, pay me. I liked that enormously.
What about for you, Lee? What about the kind of the aesthetics?
I thought they nailed the aesthetic of a spacefaring tramp steamer beautifully. What Derek said in spades, the attitudes, the interactions with a mixed gender crew, I'm not going to say insubordination, but the captain didn't get no respect. Companioning with Outland, I think, is dead on.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got the whole corporate mind, the people who make the corporate, who prop up the corporation, are in both cases grimy blue collared.
Elektra?
I I'm going to bring up another thing that was happening a little bit before this, I think, in time, which was Robin of Sherwood, which was a Showtime series about Robin Hood, and it showed people living in the forest and they weren't clean. And they weren't wearing sparkling, unrun tights. They looked like they could live in the forest. And this was the same sort of aesthetic moved into space. These people looked like they could live on a ship where things were a little bit tight and, they'd been fudging things and repairing things as they went, and they'd been out there for a while. And what happens when you've been doing the same thing for a while and you got to fudge the repairs a little bit. And there was definitely, they had that camaraderie down where all the pieces of the people were a well-oiled ship, and they weren't being super fussy. They weren't calling the captain, and they were just doing everything right. And everybody was eating together. There wasn't any fussiness. They weren't wearing proper uniforms. It felt like they were a group of people you wanted to know. They were my people, They were a bunch of geeky people that went out there, and they were making the money, and they were going to come back and do stuff at home. And they were going to come back with decent money. They were the sort of people who would go out to the oil fields of Alaska and work there for a year or 2 years to make a bunch of dough, because you make good money if you'll leave your family. And these were those guys now translated to space.
So, looking at the second film, Aliens, which to me is my favorite, and I think there's a lot of arguments for is probably the best film in the series, because it combined that, but it was also military sci-fi, right? There was military spec in it. I thought we got a much bigger kind of a view of what's the universe we're sitting in, but it carried that continuum. But I think that we got to see a larger view of the culture they were coming from. The fact of in there, she's going and saying, by the time she gets picked up and rescued, she's got no family. Everybody's dead. It's her and a cat, right? So, Lee, what about for the Aliens film and that? What was your take on that particular piece? How did you take it? What did it mean to you in the bigger piece as a follow-up?
Okay, I'm kind of cheating because several years ago at a Dragon Con, I was moderating a panel on child stars in genre. Linda Blair and Carrie Henn. It was Carrie's first convention, and she was terrified. And fortunately, Linda Blair was late getting on set. She like 20 minutes in before she got there. So I basically interviewed Carrie and got her channeled into the audience. And so I got to hear stories from her side of the things. They tried very hard not to frighten her, because to my mind, Aliens is a scarier movie, even than Alien. Even though I put bruises on my watch partners, because there's more of a stake this time. I mean, it's Ripley protecting a kid, but you still got the basics set up. There's an android. You've got a military presence now, which there were some interesting characters there. But I thought it was the perfect sequel, and I'm going out on a limb and say it's better than Alien.
Elektra, what are your thoughts on the second
First, I wanted to mention to Derek that I also have that Alan Dean Foster Alien novelization. I think I have most of them. I went to see Aliens in the theater, and I was absolutely thrilled that they didn't try to do the same exact cookie cutter, let's do exactly the same story again. Yay. Um, I was by then a huge fan of Alien because by then I had seen it a couple of times and I was looking forward to seeing where they would go with it. And I loved where they took it. And we were jumping up and down, screaming, and, sitting there in the first row, which is where I prefer to see movies. I like to get really engrossed in them. And I love Aliens to death. It's my favorite of the series as well. They never came close with any of the sequels to just the excitement in that one and the sensibility of the stupidity of the corporations thinking they could send just one company of Marines to, good as those Marines were, to go catch an alien, and Sigourney Weaver warning them that these aliens were just unbelievably well-equipped killing machines. And then the super secret mission of maybe we could capture one. Sure you could. Yeah. And the company man that got his, that was kind of cool too. There were, and Michael Biehn is just absolutely amazing in that. Bill Paxton is absolutely awesome as just like the guy who's terrified, and Jean Goldstein as, I never remember her character's name, is just remarkable. They made her up, and she is just, as a tough Marine, she is something else. Jeanette. I should probably have looked it up. She just kicks ass, takes names until
Vasquez, wasn't it? Is it Vasquez? That I'm trying to remember which
yeah,
one.
Vasquez,
that's it.
Yeah.
Yep.
She kicks ass and takes names until she doesn't, and then she goes out like a Marine should. Oh, that movie is just wonderful.
Derek, how about
mention Ripley at all because Lee did such a good job of going to the core of the movie.
Derek? How about for you?
I'm going to have the minority position on this panel, but I want to clarify something. If I say I prefer the first one, it is only because my aesthetic sense tends to be more towards that kind of material. When you're dealing with the first movie, you are dealing with what is in essence a haunted house story. It is a cosmic horror story. This is the field of H.P. Lovecraft. This is the field of a lot of those guys who are basically trying to explore the other and find it absolutely incomprehensible. So I admire that quite a bit. All the other stuff about the company and, am I going to get a share if we do this and that sort of thing. It's deliberately vague and can actually allow people to see themselves in that kind of position, because we've worked with companies where we don't get the kind of respect we deserve. We've worked with bosses that we may like, but really we don't want to be there. That sort of thing. Once you get into a situation where you're trying to build a world, you're trying to answer the basic questions: how does this function? What does this do? It can still be riveting, but suddenly you're no longer in a horror story. It becomes harder to sustain that sense of fear and dread. But having said that, I like the fact that James Cameron still keeps things relatively vague. We don't know all about the Weiland Corporation or anything like that. We don't know how much their stock is trading for. We don't know, we don't know if they're making the sneakers that everybody's wearing on board or anything like that. It's still just a matter of, companies getting rich off of our backs. I'm curious as to how the Marines are now going to be in the employ of this mega corporation. So it's suddenly, so the fact that we don't have those questions answered still leaves a lot for us to sort of explore. What does any of this mean? And especially at the time that was being made, let's keep in mind, we still had a presence. We were having a military presence in Central America. So that was where a lot of the symbolism and a lot of the metaphor was residing. And that's where some of it was residing. There was a lot of metaphor with regards to Vietnam. And I will say that my stepfather, who was a Vietnam veteran, absolutely loved this one because it had the sense of, in some cases, just the sense of boredom. Is there anything I can do? I don't know. Is there anything you can do, to help the Marines? The sort of the breakdowns in command when something goes wrong, or just the breakdown of strategy and tactics when your commanding officer thinks they know what they're doing, but has really not been out of ROTC for too long. So there's a lot that I admire, but I even though I watch it regularly, it is certainly fun, and certainly I would say it's at least as comparable to the first movie. Number one, they're two vastly different beings, and number two, there's always a part of me. And this is the fault of filmmaking. It is not a fault of genre, but filmmakers don't really know how to do world building. I'm usually not terribly interested in world building in the first place, but filmmakers often really don't know how to do that. So,
Well, I'm a little reticent to do this, but let's talk about Alien 3. Okay, now we've talked about Alien 3. I think there was an opportunity here when you start with two films like this that were really so different, so pivotal. How do you build on that, right? That's a hard legacy to do. I think that notion of Ripley having gone through the experience she has, that notion of how they ended it, had they stopped there,
That's
interesting
2 hours
idea.
of my life I will never get back.
But the notion of the prison planet. So Elektra, I'll let you I'll turn you loose on Alien 3. And if we want to, let's go ahead and partner in Alien Resurrection, the film that the only thing redeeming to the entire thing is Sigourney Weaver making that basketball shot.
That is Alien 3 is like 2+ hours of my life I will never get back. It the setup for it doesn't make a lot of sense. The prison planet itself is fine, but that could have been a different movie that wasn't an alien movie. Everybody loved Newt. I really liked the character that Michael Biehn played, Hicks, and everybody just loved Ripley, but Ripley was really attached to Hicks and Newt, and they killed them off screen. That just sucked. And then this whole idea of like having it chase them in the prison planet, they were trying to redo the first movie and they did it badly. The first movie is awesome and stands alone, and they're just not going to hit anything that good again. Resurrection had its moments, not many of them, but it had a few. They had already done the android thing to death almost, and okay, we're going to have another artificial person. And yeah, that didn't work for me either. I went to see all of these in the theater after I missed Alien. I went to see Aliens and God help me, Alien 3. And I went to see Resurrection. And Yeah, that didn't work either. Um, I'm sorry. After that, I gave up and watched them when they came out on HBO or whatever. It just, I was sad. I do watch Aliens when it comes back around quite a bit, because that's always good for a few laughs.
So, Derek, how about for you? Well, in talking Alien 3 and Resurrection, and the reason I'm kind of lumping them both together is because they were both, eh, it was almost Alien, the cash grab. Um,
Okay, here's I'm gonna alienate the entire panel. Alienate
You won't, no matter
that was
what you
not
do.
that was not intentional to
a
say
quarter
that.
point. You get a bonus point for that.
Thank you, thank you. Now you're going to take it away when I say I actually happen to love Alien 3, if for no other reason than it refuses to show its viewer a good time. It almost demands that you sit there and take it. And I have to kind of admire a movie that has that kind of hostility towards its audience. I want it clear. I'm not saying it is a good movie. I am not even saying it's something I recommend. It is not. But it is one I happen to love because its ambitions are so cynical and off the wall, and it knows it, that I can't help but admire it in some ways. Having said that, I think what happens with, once you get past these first two movies, you run into the same rut that a lot of science fictional material tends to fall into. And it's this. Um, the first Alien, when it was released, and I'm cribbing from the writer Jason Parjan, who pointed this out at one point. The first Alien movie is far more than a slasher film in outer space. It actually functions as a mystery. We don't know anything about this alien planet. That's what we discover. We don't know anything about the eggs, which is why we go in and realize that there is something moving in the eggs. We try to deal with the face hugger, but we don't know. We find out in trying to remove it that it has its own built-in mechanism, defenses. We then are questioning, okay, so when are we going to actually deal with when are we going to have an issue with the actual alien? When is this going to come through? And this is when we learn about its biology. Aliens does something very similar in that we get the question of what happens if you have a whole bunch of them. Do you actually is there just one? No, there turns out that there's a colony. Okay, we know that they are grown through eggs. What lays the eggs? That becomes an additional mystery. Alien 3 doesn't attempt to solve that, ask any questions like that at all. So it's basically just, for lack of a better word, a slasher picture that doesn't contribute really anything new to its material. I never saw Alien Resurrection, but I would say with Prometheus, Covenant, and even Romulus to a certain extent, we're not getting any of those questions answered either. Now, I will say, not every franchise needs that. And I'm thinking of the Quiet Place movies. The third one, to my mind, is the best of the bunch. Even though it doesn't expand lore in any way. It just gives you the setup. Aliens will attack you if you make any kind of noise. And then it tells a very human story because all you need is that background. But Alien almost demands that you have something new to contribute. What do we know about this species? What else have we learned about it? How is it going to affect our protagonists here? Because, I mean, look, it's very difficult to actually get a different group of people to come into contact. What are you going to have an accountant try to come in and audit the aliens? No, it's simply not going to work like that.
Lee?
I'm a wimp. I admit it. I sort of kind of watched the third one once. And I bow to Elektra as Queen of Snark. She said it better than I could. After that, I more or less, I'd read synopsis and that's about it. They just, I don't disagree with what Derek said. And as a cast in a different universe, that would have been wonderful. But it wasn't. It didn't fulfill the promise of the first two. It was, as you say, Aliens cash grab. It's sort of like other notable franchises that just keep going until they can't go anymore because the cast is dead.
Mm-hmm.
Not the the actors have aged out or died. It just this is why the first two are so much a part of my viewing and history, because three booted me right out of that universe.
Well, and there are a couple things that I will say for three that I thought brought something. I mean, that notion of, yes, it's a prison planet, but the cultural aspects that they had developed within that, they had almost developed that cult, that religion within it, right? I thought that there were some interesting parts to that, but that could have been any universe. I mean, I think the biggest problem was, and I mean, there was problems outside of the film that led to this, but basically they broke up the found family trope they had created by the end of Aliens. By, killing off Hicks, killing off Newt. They really had lost that sense of the found family you had at the end of it. That was, to me, was the biggest part of the payoff. And so by killing that going into episode 3, and again, there was or the third film, and again, there was a lot of stuff behind that as to what happened there, but off screen. But, when I looked at that, to me, there were still things there, and the fact that they went and said, okay, we're going to close this out. We acknowledge what we are. Ripley has been impregnated. You can only go through this so many times and only be lucky so many times. Plot armor only does so much for you. We're going to do the Terminator move of, we're going to drop you into the molten lava just to take care of that. And to me, there was a certain poetic nature to that of having lost everything, having been through all of that, is what needs to happen. And I thought that there was a certain essence to that idea. Resurrection for me, however, I thought that there was an interesting idea in that notion of how they brought Ripley back being a hybrid. I thought there was some fun. I thought there was some interesting stuff to the idea. But it could have just as well been any, heist movie in space. It was not, really didn't have, to me, a lot of that alien feel outside of, who the bad guy happened to be. But, we look at and Derek, to go back to your point, though, the mystery created out of the first couple of films, right? The first mystery we get is, and I remember being a kid watching Alien the first time, sitting there looking at it as they go over the jockey, right? We see the alien sitting in the seat, and it's like, is that supposed to be a being? Is that what is that? Just because it was so large, so much larger than life. Well, looking at that, looking at the art of H.R. Geiger, looking at the very unique aesthetic to all of that, when we look carrying forward into Prometheus and Covenant and some of these films, I think there is a little bit of that notion of the question of, well, who are the progenitors, right? We kind of leap past the aliens themselves to a bit here, to the other side of it, of who are these progenitors. So, Derek, based on everything you've seen, done, looked at, how do you kind of take the engineers?
Sparingly.
With a little bit of salt?
Yeah, I mean it'll bring out the flavor if you don't use too much. I don't know. Yeah, I think here's where I start. Here's where a lot of my need to sort of understand what's happening wars with what I think is going to make effective story. If you're looking at this as science fiction, you need to make it far more compelling and give far more resonance or awe kind of than what we got. I never thought the engineers were terribly interesting. We don't, it's not only that we don't know the motives, but the motives seem arbitrary, or at least they're written in an arbitrary fashion. So I don't have a lot of interest for how they're doing that. I remember the promotional material for Prometheus focused a lot on the Wyland Corporation. We got Wyland motivational videos, and rather than actually go in that direction and talk about what does a future corporate what is a future corporate culture actually look like? How many people are involved? What kind of, what does this do economically to anybody who's involved in this? Do we have a third Gilded Age? Do we have something that operates, like Bob Black's abolition of work? Do you have just people who can do things? And instead, what we get is a focus on these really vague creatures who have some kind of plan. Do we know what that plan is? No. Do the writers know what that plan is? Probably not. For me, this is where it all becomes increasingly frustrating. If you're going to do a science fiction story, then you don't need to tell us these things, but you at least need to have some kind of answer to what's happening. And that doesn't seem to happen.
Lee?
One hopes when one goes to a movie or picks up a book or turns on the TV that the story being told is well served. It's identifiable enough as genre or whatever. But regardless of what genre it is, the story is served. And to a certain extent, the genre is served. What little I saw of Covenant and what I've read about Resurrection, none of these apply. The only thing served was, can we get people in the seat? Which is really too bad. I like you, Jim. I would have liked to have seen. Okay, they set it up this way. What was the reason? How did they do it? What are they going to do with it? Not there. World building essentially got short shrift. And aside from a certain pairing with another universe, which I have seen, I'm not sure why. For me,
Scotch
it
was
ended.
involved.
Hmm?
Scotch was involved. We know.
Yeah, well, it could have been good. And that, to me, is the saddest thing one can say. It could have been good.
Elektra?
I know I've seen both Prometheus and Covenant. I'm sure I'm going to get the two of them mixed up. The things I can remember is that I desperately wanted both of those movies to be good. because of all the advanced press on them and all the cool stuff they were pushing and how much I had liked previous movies. And I thought that the stuff about the Wayland Corporation was really cool. And then they started doing incredibly stupid stuff. They sent a ship full of scientists off on a mission and didn't actually give them all the information until like they got there. No one does that. No one. They sent people when were well prepared to go off and explore, and then they did dumb things once they got to the actual exploring part. And I was tearing my hair out. It just over the stupidity, especially since we all know what happens when you mess with alien and alien-like creatures.
They didn't even give the nobody's wearing like a vac suit or an environmental suit or anything like that. Just dumb things like that.
Well, because alien planets are safe, right? So they just did stupid things, and we all know what happens to people who do stupid things. They could have been so awesome, and then they weren't. Yeah. They make you cry. And so, yeah, maybe it was a cash grab, and maybe they couldn't come up with a good idea on time. Were they working with a deadline?
Well, I will say this. When I looked at the original marketing for Prometheus, they had, I was traveling somewhere, I forget where I was, but in the airport, they had the large engineer's head in the airport. I know they did the same thing where they did kind of recreate the temple. I want to say they did that somewhere in Europe. It may have been Paris. It's either London or Paris. I think they put this whole promotional thing down in part of the underground. When I saw the opening of Prometheus and it was the, hey, take a shot of black liquid, we all know from the X-Files that's always a bad idea. But, he takes a shot of black liquid and he just sort of dissolves into the lake. It's like, okay, this is going to be something interesting in terms of lore. You sort of get an idea that something happened, but you never really know what. And so for me, there was a whole lot here of either A, there was something intended to be told, or B, we were given a lot to infer from it. But again, I think there was a lot of things here in setup that were promises made that didn't really get a good answer. But one of the things I think that we saw developed much more in Prometheus and Covenant and these films is the notion of androids in society, right? If we go back to the original, we go back to Alien and Aliens and seeing androids and the general lack of trust there. Yeah, I think this is where we get to see a little bit of that crossover, for example, with Blade Runner, right? You can get a sense that, these could just as easily have been the replicants from the Replicant War or, tied into that period. So I think that there's a lot of crossover with the notion of artificial life and what does artificial intelligence mean? You've got Mother on the ship, these different things. So, Lee, when we look at kind of that part of the technology at the time, androids, some of the AI, we see those parts of this. And as we later on see in some later films, I know you haven't necessarily gone through all of them, but David is kind of the catalyst for what happens with the aliens as this purge of humanity. Kind of how do you view how they approach using these technologies, sentient technologies in the universe?
One comment. They talked to Mother on the original Alien, and there's a lot of information there, but I rewatched it over the weekend, and all of the screens are just covered in like ones and zeros because they didn't have a solid idea of what futuristic computer screens would look like back in the 70s. And so I guess they thought binary was the language of the future. And that was the one feature that did not age well. Was
That
they
almost
were old TV screens covered in ones and zeros.
But the
The rest
makers
of
used
it
it.
is aged really well. And
yeah.
it's still just as scary, even if you know where the jump scares are coming. All right, I'll shut up now.
The technology, for the most part, was appropriate to the setup they had created. Most of the tech on board the Nostromo looked like maybe they had gotten it second, third hand. But it worked. And even with Ash, the Android, they were projecting that he could fit in. That he wouldn't be, jerky motions, that sort of thing. He wasn't Data, but for the most part, I think they played shorthand in a couple of cases. They cheated somewhat with the rest of the movies that I've seen pictures of, and with Alien and the military tech. They did some good projection on that, but I don't know. They weren't um, fully exploiting what they could do with the tech.
I will
Elektra?
say,
Oh,
no,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead, Derek.
I was just going to say, I wanted to say there, I completely agree with Elektra that the computer tech has not aged well at all. On the other hand, I think the fact that it is so analog actually helps contribute to the spookiness. There was briefly for a couple of years ago, a movement called analog horror. If you ever
Mhm.
if you go to YouTube, you can find things like Local 58 and Gemini Home Entertainment. These are basically horror stories that focus around analog technology, video cassettes, television. It's the very fact that these things can be grainy. These things can warp. And they have sound in a way that a modern computer system simply doesn't. So when you first see the Nostromo, when you get into the cockpit of the Nostromo, you're getting a lot of bips and bops because the computers are finally waking up. You're getting the clacks of the printouts. That contributes to this whole idea that you've got something that is going to have its own particular life in its mechanisms, which I don't think you can really do when you could probably fit the entirety of what was the Nostromo's operating system onto half of a modern iPad.
I think if you wanted to update Alien right now, the only thing you'd have to add would be a 3D printer so they could print parts. And that would be it. Because it's all just, stuff that they were keeping working.
Oh, Mother could actually have plans downloaded for possible weapons or something like that. So, we can bypass the prototype stage. Let's just print out a handful of guns. Let's see what we can do. You can still create suspense out of something like that.
Well, yeah, but Brett and Parker would just be printing stuff out. they'd be printing out repair parts and all of that. And it would just be, did they have enough, whatever it is you feed into 3D printers to make what they needed.
3D goo or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Yeah, whatever it's called.
Well, I mean, you can do pretty much anything these days. I mean, you can do, the plastics and all that, but you can do titanium, you can do different metals. I mean, there's a ton of different things you can do 3D printing with to do and craft parts. And we've been going here for a pretty good while, and there's a lot of other areas we can go, but I kind of want to give everybody, what's something we haven't talked about or something else we need to dive deeper into. So,
Jonesy.
yeah.
Is Jonesy actually a flirkin? That's been bothering me ever since I rewatched it.
That would be my assumption, but we can only hope.
I agree. I think he might be. I think he just, kept it under pause, as it were.
Well,
I tend to agree.
if he'd been a good flirkin, we wouldn't have had much of a movie other than the fact he'd had a little indigestion, but
I think it
He's
really.
a great character.
Yes.
Whoever decided to write that cat in, well, it was Dan O'Bannon, obviously, but, Dan O'Bannon is a fantastic, fantastic writer, and the script is a marvel.
So I'm gonna mention something that it's a kind of a private joke, but it's something that I find profound. I have a friend who loves old science fiction media, and we used to go over to his home. He used to host movie parties, and we would try to identify at one point the 5 things all cheesy science fiction movies from the 1950s have. And those are somebody serves coffee, bonus points if it's served by a woman. Somebody lights a cigarette, bonus points if a man lights it for a woman. Number 3, the appearance of beakers and or test tubes. Number 4, mention of the artificial gravity device so that we know why people just aren't floating around the ship. And number 5, BHP, Bad Hatch Protocol, where somebody does something that lets the monster out of the ship or does something that takes the monster inside the ship. Alien, at least the first one, has all 5 of these features. And it just, I find it so fascinating because, this is a friend who likes some of the worst of of this material.
Well, are there bonus points for the fact that Ripley tries desperately to keep them in the airlock because, he's broken his suit and you can't come in. You're contaminated. And she actually has a fight with Dallas about that.
Yeah. He does not.
The whole movie could have ended there.
It could have. And in his view, the second Ash opens the door and says, "Inner hatch open," we have Bad Hatch Protocol. Nobody's listening. Nobody's following the right thing. We're trying to avoid Bad Hatch Protocol, and it gets in anyway.
She's very good at rules. And it serves her fairly well in Aliens.
Well, and I think but that goes again to a good point about the difference between the first and the second one. The first one is a trucker crew who's trying to follow protocols versus the second one is following more military protocols, which is, well, if it's there, we can kill it. It'll be fine. But I think that there's a lot there to both of those. Lee, what have you got that we haven't touched on?
How very much, at least in my opinion, Alien honored the things that made the earliest horror movies so good. Most of the violence took place off screen for a large part of it. um, you didn't see the alien, big one, until well into the movie. The changing the number of beats. Okay, you expected the jump, the sprite to come here, and they waited 3 extra beats. The way they timed things. It was, in many regards, an homage to the best of classic horror in film.
So I'm gonna throw one kind of quick little bonus out there, just because, and I don't know if any of you guys have seen this, but in the comics, they've done an entire run where the aliens make it to Earth, and mayhem ensues. Let's just be nice. It's a buffet for the aliens. The xenomorphs get to, snack on whatever they want to. It's, kind of wide open. Have any of y'all seen any of those storylines? And what would you want to see about if, through the corporation, the xenomorphs actually made it to Earth? If anybody wants that
On the
one.
corporation.
Never read any of the comics. I read William Gibson's original treatment for Alien 3. And even then...
Was it better?
Yes, with a caveat. It has the same issue, the same fundamental issue, in that it doesn't really present anything new. It's basically 80s Cold War paranoia, for lack of a better word, with the aliens kind of as window dressing. I think it succeeds on some level, but I'm still kind of indifferent to it. I always was a little bit miffed that the promo for Alien 3, the very first promo for Alien 3, suggested that it was going to take place on Earth, and we never got there. It would have been interesting to see how entire populations and entire civilizations have to deal with this eldritch horror from outer space.
Elektra, any thoughts?
I mean, it would have been really interesting to see the corporation get theirs, but it would have been at the payment of lots of innocent people. And I mean, it would have made for an interesting film, but I don't know how you kill them once they do what they did to the colony and aliens. I mean, once they've got enough people incubating eggs, you need a lot of flamethrowers.
And I've seen synopses of that storyline. I've read parts of it. But definitely it was definitely an interesting piece in terms of it carried through a lot of that notion of conspiracy, the corporation's government, and how all of that worked to fail. So it's an interesting storyline that kind of carries out to an interesting point. I'll save us the pain of the crossovers, right? AVP, which I thought was a fun film. I will watch it every time. It's a fun, but definitely does not. It adds a little bit to the universe, I would say. Getting to meet, Mr. Whalen as he's coughing and dying. That notion. Requiem. No, but the first one, AVP, was at least fun fan service, and it did what it needed to do. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, what they need to be picking up in the process of it. So, Elektra, you're up first.
I'm Elektra Hammond. You can find me online at untilmidnight.com. I do most of my socials on Mastodon, where I'm Elektra at wandering.shop, and I have a new book out, which is Permutations. I have a story in here. It's a new story. It's a new mosaic novel of Well World stories from Jack Chalker's Well World. You can find it wherever fine books are sold. And that is me.
Derek?
My website's DerekAustinJohnson.com. You can find me on the Book of Faces, Where Skies Are Blue, on the Clock app. My most recent story was in Parsec magazine, which is digital. My upcoming story, Jellies, is going to be in Midnight Tales, out a little later this summer.
Lee?
Hi, again, I'm Lee Martindale. I am found most reliably at harphaven.net. They are links to my ebook store, or my e-store, hardcovers and autographs available. Also links to my online presences. So stop by, say hi.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingpros.com, and of course here at Continual. And we will see you again soon. Thanks everybody for joining us.